All right, so thank you for that introduction. Before I begin, I want to acknowledge the unusual circumstances that bring us together today. As you know, this talk was originally scheduled to be delivered at the APA annual meeting in San Francisco. Shortly before the presentation, the lecture was removed from the schedule following pressure and threats of violence from outside groups. I'm therefore extremely grateful to my colleagues who spoke up to have this lecture rescheduled. They come from all backgrounds: Jewish, Muslim, Christian, Hindu, Buddhist, Arab, Palestinian, LGBTQ, and many others. I'm especially thankful to my Jewish colleagues who rejected the false binary that concern for Palestinian human rights is somehow a betrayal of Jewish identity. Their voices remind us that the Jewish traditions of humanism, social justice, and tikkun olam remain among the strongest moral resources available in confronting human suffering. I'm also grateful to the APA leadership for ultimately rescheduling this event and creating this space for this important discussion. I'm also pleased that this lecture now coincides with Gay Pride Month, which is underway now, and I express my strong solidarity with LGBTQ members and condemn the recent political targeting of this vulnerable community. Today reminds us of another moment in the history of psychiatry, when speaking an uncomfortable truth carried political risk. Dr. John Fryer, appearing as Dr. Anonymous before the APA in 1972, challenged our profession's complicity with injustice by classifying homosexuality as a disease. His courage helped psychiatry recognize that what is widely accepted and politically expedient can nonetheless be profoundly wrong. Today, Gaza poses a similar challenge. Whether our profession is willing to examine prevailing assumptions, confront uncomfortable realities, and bear witness to human suffering of all people, even when doing so is politically unpopular. The views expressed today are my own. I do not speak on behalf of the APA or any other organization. I speak as a psychiatrist and as a human being on behalf of my colleagues, patients, and community at large, who have suffered a profound sense of moral injury, helplessness, and institutional betrayal since the barbaric attacks on October 7 and the subsequent mass killing and even more barbaric atrocities ever since that have been televised directly to our cell phones for the last 2.5 years. I am humbled to receive an award named after Dr. Chester M. Pierce, one of the most visionary psychiatrists in American history. Dr. Pierce gave language to the experiences that were widely felt but not allowed to be expressed. He named the unspoken daily humiliations, insults, injustices, and racism expressed by the African American community as microaggressions. He reminded us that the most offensive reactions are not gross and crippling, but subtle and stunning. But if unchecked, they have the potential to transform into dramatic and obvious macroaggressions, such as lynching, mass killing, and yes, indeed, genocide. I would also like to acknowledge my mentor and dear friend, Dr. Elliot Sorel, a Jewish psychiatrist from Romania, who opened his heart not only to me, but to people of all backgrounds. I was privileged to work alongside him during a campaign to rename APA Human Rights Award in honor of Dr. Chester M. Pierce. I am therefore deeply honored and pleased to receive this honor in memory of Dr. Sorel. I wish to thank APA Foundation for making this award possible and for their extraordinary work. I also wish to thank Dr. Astina Chow, who nominated me for this award, and Drs. Ravi Chandra and Constance Dunlap for their wonderful support, friendship, and scholarly critique for this lecture. I also want to recognize Dr. Stephen Sharfstein, a past president of the APA, whose principled opposition to torture after September 11 remains an enduring example of ethical leadership in psychiatry. He reminded us that our profession must not merely discuss social determinants of health, we must also engage with the social realities that profoundly affect the well-being of our patients and communities. Yes, indeed, we live in a climate of rising hate, intolerance, and polarization. fueled by white supremacy, racism, exclusionary ideologies. Jewish, Muslim, immigrants, LGBT, and other vulnerable communities have experienced increasing harassment, discrimination, threats, and violence. While political actors and social media have amplified division, conspiracy theories, and dehumanization narratives against Muslims and Jews alike. The day this lecture was originally scheduled, a terrorist attack occurred in San Diego. Two teenagers armed not only with firearms but also with Nazi hate symbols attacked a mosque and killed 3 Muslim worshippers. They left behind a 75-page manifesto steeped in the Nazi ideology, white supremacy, and great replacement theory. The manifesto described Jews as universal enemies and, quote, sons of Satan, and praised previous attacks on religious communities. One of those previous attacks was on the 2018 Tree of Life Synagogue in Pittsburgh. In the aftermath of that tragedy, Jewish, Muslim, and Christian communities came together in solidarity against hate. The Muslim community in Pittsburgh raised more than $120,000 to help repair the synagogue. The white supremacist who murdered 11 worshippers believed that the Jews were orchestrating a genocide of white population through immigration. Before the attack, he wrote on the social media that, quote, the filthy evil Jews are bringing, quote, the filthy evil Muslims into the country. His ideology illustrates how anti-Semitism and Islamophobia are not separate phenomena, but deeply intertwined expression of the same hate. Surveys consistently show that individuals who have negative views of Muslims are also far more likely to hold negative views of Jews and other minorities, underscoring the shared psychological roots of prejudice, exclusion, and intolerance. And this is the central ethical and psychological principle. When the suffering of any population is minimized, justified, or treated as morally acceptable, the consequences extend far beyond the immediate victims. Dehumanization of Palestinians does not remain confined to Palestinians. It normalizes prejudice, it weakens universal moral standards, and creates conditions that fuel anti-Semitism, Islamophobia, racism, and other forms of group-based hatred. The protection of any community ultimately depends on defending the equal dignity and humanity of all communities. The destruction in Gaza is unfortunately beyond belief. The tiny Gaza Strip has been subjected to more than 85 kilotons of bombing since October 7, 2023, equivalent to an explosive force of nearly 6 atomic bombs. Virtually everything in Gaza has been destroyed, and the entire strip has been reduced to a toxic rubble. Close to 100,000 civilians, half of them children, have been killed directly by bombing or died a slow, excruciating death under the rubble. The indirect death toll from disease, starvation, dehydration, and collapse of healthcare is likely to be many times higher. Nearly the entire population has been forced into a narrow, barren coastal area in the south, living in makeshift tents without adequate shelter, sanitation, food, medicine, electricity, or fuel. Children are dying not only from bombs and hunger, but also from preventable infections, including severe injuries from insect and rat bites in extremely overcrowded encampments. And children are indeed the main victims in Gaza, as half of the population is children. Gaza has the largest cohort of amputated children in the history. Most, if not all, of these amputations were carried out without anesthesia. Imagine a child having his or her limbs cut off without anesthesia. There's a complete siege preventing life-saving medications and surgical supplies from entering Gaza. Children in Gaza are at risk from the day they are born. 90% of the births in Gaza are premature, yet surfactant, a medicine only used to treat newborn respiratory distress, is banned. Even infant formulas have been banned or severely restricted. Tens of thousands of children have perished, and hundreds of thousands more are at imminent risk of death. One of these children was Hind Rajab, a 5-year-old Palestinian girl, and this is her story. think it's the ad for some reason. Try again. Okay. I can just summarize the situation. Hind Rajab was killed along with 8 members of her family when she was trying to flee Gaza City. She called 911 equivalent in Red Crescent in Gaza, and they sent an ambulance with 2 rescuers. They were also killed. Her body was found 2 weeks later. Her car had 335 bullet holes in it, shot from a tank just a few meters away, according to the forensic analysis. So this siege in Gaza has created man-made famine and extreme shortage of food and water in Gaza. A bag of flour that sells for between $5 and $10 in the US is reportedly selling for between $300 and $1,000 in Gaza. Gazans have been deprived of arable land to grow food. Israeli authorities just last week announced that they will encroach another 10% of Gaza, bringing the total to 70%. Even though Gaza is a coastal strip and has always relied on fishing, Israeli authorities have banned fishing. Any Palestinians who cross the so-called yellow line in search of food or try to fish are shot and killed. Unfortunately, this killing in Gaza has continued despite the so-called ceasefire announced last year. While the attention of the world is largely turned elsewhere, every day dozens of civilians, including children, are killed by bombing and hundreds more die from lack of medical care. Starvation and deliberately inflated conditions calculated to bring about death, disease, starvation, and destruction. Some say that the word genocide should not be used in context of Gaza because it's offensive, inflammatory, or even anti-Semitic. I would respectfully point out that if there is anything truly offensive to the medical community, it is the large-scale killing, maiming, starvation, and suffering of children and civilians. Our primary obligation is not to protect ourselves from uncomfortable words, but to confront human suffering honestly and respond to it wherever it occurs. Some argue that the word genocide should not be used because the International Court of Justice has not yet issued a final verdict. This is a misunderstanding of both of the international law and historical practice. ICJ has not formally declared any of the other atrocities commonly referred to as genocide by the APA and the psychiatric community, including Rwanda, Rohingya, Cambodia, and Darfur. The ICJ has never even adjudicated the Holocaust as genocide, despite the fact that both ICJ and Genocide Convention were established as a direct result of the Holocaust. In fact, the only conflict the ICJ has formally recognized as genocide was the 1995 Srebrenica massacre, a determination made 12 years later in 2007. However, in 2 landmark decisions in 2024, ICJ recognized the plausibility of genocide claims in Gaza and allowed the South Africa case to proceed. It appears that the use of term genocide in the context of Gaza is supported by the available evidence. Gaza appears to meet all 5 prohibited acts identified in the Genocide Convention, namely the killing members of a protected group, causing serious bodily or mental harm, inflicting conditions of life calculated to bring about physical destruction, imposing measures intended to prevent births and evidence by withholding perinatal care, and forcible transfer of children not only inside the strip, but also the mass incarcerations and abuse of Palestinian children in Israeli prisons. The situation in Gaza has been described as by virtually every human rights organization, legal experts, UN agencies, Holocaust and genocide scholars around the world as a textbook case of genocide. Crucially, the obligations under 1948 Genocide Convention arise independently of any final genocide determination. In its 2007 judgment in Bosnia versus Serbia, the court unequivocally held that the duty to prevent genocide begins, quote, at the instant the state learns or should normally have learned of the existence of a serious risk that genocide will be committed. The convention therefore imposes obligations at a stage of credible risk and plausible evidence. The same ethical principle applies to medical and professional organizations. The time to prevent suffering and to speak against mass atrocities is now, when there is still some chance of saving the children of Gaza, not when they're already dead. Psychiatry has a responsibility not only to treat the trauma originating from racism, hatred, stereotyping, and violence, but also to recognize, challenge, and prevent the psychological conditions that make mass atrocities possible. All too often, our profession has failed this obligation, from providing scientific justifications to slavery and eugenics, to pathologizing civil rights activism as protest psychosis, to labeling human sexuality as mental illness. Psychiatry has repeatedly aligned itself with power rather than justice. These failures remind us that professional silence in the face of suffering is not neutrality, it's complicity. Unfortunately, the dehumanizing portrayals of Arabs and Palestinians are not uncommon in psychiatric literature. In this 1972 article published in the American Journal of Psychiatry, the learned author characterizes Arabs as driven by violence, irrationality, shame, and a collective need for revenge. He further argues that Arabs are incapable of individual action because Arab society is fundamentally organized around patron-client relationship rather than personal autonomy. The article concludes that unlike Israelis, Arabs are culturally predisposed to killing. Such views remain relevant today because such narratives continue to be invoked to explain, justify, or minimize Palestinian suffering. The October 7 attacks involved the deliberate killing of civilians, hostage-taking, sexual violence, torture, and indiscriminate attacks that constitute grave violations of international humanitarian law and amount to war crimes. Acknowledging these crimes is essential not only for justice and accountability, but also for upholding the universal principle that all civilian lives deserve equal protection. American medical and psychiatric associations rightfully condemned the October 7 attacks forcefully and immediately, issuing public statements within days. Yet no comparable condemnations have been issued for the grave and sustained violations of human rights and medical neutralities that have followed since, including the destruction of hospitals and healthcare infrastructure and withholding of essential food and medical supplies and death of more than 1,500 healthcare workers and destruction of all 32 hospitals in Gaza over the last 31 months. The APA's own statement on October 7 declared that the brutalities of Hamas must end. Is it too much to ask now for a similar statement that the embargo of life-saving medications, food, and humanitarian aid in Gaza must end? The glaring asymmetry raises difficult questions about whether our professional societies are guided primarily by medical ethics and universal human rights, or merely by political expediency. My colleagues here at the APA may not realize that all 8 psychiatrists and approximately 20 psychologists have been killed in Gaza, along with more than 200 mental health workers, often together with their entire families. The only psychiatric hospital in Gaza, a 40-bed facility in Gaza City, was bombed and destroyed early on in the conflict, killing patients and staff inside. The burden of mental illness in Gaza was already extraordinarily high. Today, virtually the entire population is living with severe trauma while facing complete absence of psychiatric medications, therapy, or mental health treatment. I cannot help but wonder why this is not a concern for the largest psychiatric organization in the world that prides itself on being the global leader in psychiatry and seeks worldwide acceptance of its diagnostic and ethical frameworks. My own interest in psychiatry emerged from learning about the Holocaust. Growing up as a member of a persecuted religious minority in Pakistan, I naturally sympathized with the Jewish experience and was drawn to the history of anti-Semitism and the Holocaust. My interest was solidified by a visit at a formative age to Prague and a nearby concentration camp at Terezin. I became deeply interested in understanding the psychological mechanisms that underlie mass violence, discrimination, prejudice, and social injustice. questions that have remained central to my professional life ever since. It is difficult to overestimate the importance of Holocaust in the world history, contemporary Jewish life, identity, and collective memory. The scale of suffering, brutality, and loss remains almost incomprehensible, even 80 years later. The October 7 attacks understandably reopened some of these wounds, reviving profound anxieties about the vulnerability, persecution, and survival of the Jewish people. However, the sacred memory of the Holocaust should not be invoked to justify large-scale violence and political hegemony in any context. The Holocaust also had a profound impact on psychiatry itself, giving rise to a vast body of scholarship on trauma, mass violence, genocide, obedience, complicity, and moral injury from a diverse vantage point, such as psychoanalytical, social, cognitive, and behavioral perspectives. The central lesson emerging from these studies is both sobering and humbling. The capacity for cruelty is not confined to any particular nation, religion, ethnicity, or people. Under the right social, political, and psychological conditions, virtually any individual or group can become capable of inflicting extraordinary violence upon others. The study of genocide, therefore, teaches not only about the perpetrators and victims, but about the universal human vulnerabilities that demand constant ethical vigilance. Perhaps the most influential contribution to this literature is Robert J. Lifton's The Nazi Doctors, which is an in-depth study of German physicians who participated in Nazi killing apparatus, including doctors involved in the selections at death camps, including Joseph Mengele, the so-called angel of death. Lifton was struck by the fact that all of these physicians continued to view themselves as moral, conscientious doctors acting in the service of German society. Few accepted personal responsibility for their actions. Instead, they framed their work as necessary, scientific, or patriotic. Seeking to understand this paradox, Lifton developed a broader psychology of genocide by examining common psychological mechanisms, by comparing the Holocaust and the Armenian genocide of 1915-1916. Lifton described genocide as a form of human sacrifice, undertaken in the pursuit of religious, racial, ethnic, or social purification. In this worldview, the targeted group comes to be seen as a source of contamination, corruption, or existential threat, a, quote, deadly victim whose destruction is portrayed as necessary for the survival, renewal, or healing of the dominant group. Genocide thus becomes a form of what Lifton called sickness unto death, a vision of total corruption requiring total cure. Once this mentality takes hold, the annihilation of the victimized group is no longer experienced as murder, but as moral, historical, and even therapeutic necessity. Lifton argued that genocide is not driven solely by hatred or fear. For perpetrators, killing can become a source of psychological elation, a sense of purpose, and even a form of collective therapy. Violence creates meaning, reinforces group identity, and offers the promise of transcendence through participation in a supposedly historic mission. In this way, genocide becomes more than the destruction of others. It becomes a distorted path to transcendence, redemption, and national rebirth, such as recreating the Aryan nation, pan-Turkic unity, or a greater Israel by conquering neighboring countries. Lifton emphasized that genocide cannot be carried out by professional killers alone. It requires the collaboration of a large number of supporters, both inside and outside the state. Beyond soldiers and executioners, genocide depends upon killing professionals, experts, physicians, scientists, engineers, and the industries that manufacture the weapons and technologies of destruction. It is also required what Lifton called a genocidal bureaucracy. The institutions, administrators, intellectuals, and opinion leaders who shield atrocities from scrutiny, provide ethical and legal justifications, and normalize violence. History offers many examples, including medical organizations that supported eugenics, and remained silent during the Holocaust. A particularly important concept is medical fundamentalism, the ideological transformation of a targeted population into a disease, infection, parasite, or tumor threatening the health of the society. Once human beings are redefined as pathology, their elimination can be prescribed as a treatment rather than murder. Thus, Heinrich Himmler described the killing of Jews as a form of delousing, illustrating how medical language can be used to sanitize and legitimize mass violence. Dehumanization plays a central role in mass atrocities because it removes the victims from the boundaries of moral, ethical, or legal concern. As social psychologist Herbert Kellman observed, genocide becomes possible when a population is placed outside the universe of moral obligation, such that its suffering, rights, and existence no longer carry the same ethical weight as those of the dominant group. Once moral exclusion occurs, actions that would otherwise be unthinkable become psychologically and socially permissible. The discourse around Gaza provides numerous examples of this process. Palestinians have been described as, quote, human animals, portrayed collectively as terrorists, denied civilian status, and framed as a demographic or civilizational threat. Political leaders have questioned whether there are any innocent civilians in Gaza and framed Palestinians as an obstacle to be removed or resolved. Such language serves an important psychological function. It reduces sympathy, normalizes suffering, and makes large-scale violence easier to justify or ignore. Another influential psychiatric perspective on large-scale or large group violence comes from Vivek Volkan, who applied psychodynamic principles to the psychology of large groups. Volkan argued that collective identities are shaped by both chosen glories, those are the shared memories of triumph, achievement, and national greatness, and chosen traumas. Those are the historical experiences of persecution, humiliation, and loss that become central to the group identity, such as the Nakba and the Shoah, both of which mean collective catastrophe. These memories are transmitted across generations and can become psychologically active long after the original events have passed. According to Volkan, opportunistic political leaders can deliberately activate those collective memories during periods of crises. Through a process he called time collapse, past traumas are experienced as if they are occurring in the present, blurring the boundary between historical memory and contemporary reality. The result is that the reactivation of transgenerational fear, rage, humiliation, and a sense of existential threat. In such circumstances, violence may come to be viewed not only as aggression, but as self-defense, historical justice, or collective survival. Volkan's work helps explain how unresolved historical trauma can be mobilized to sustain conflict, intensify group polarization, and justify actions that might otherwise be considered morally unacceptable. An enduring question in genocide scholarship is, how do compassionate, educated, and ethical individuals such as physicians and professional medical societies remain silent in the face of undeniable mass suffering? A psychodynamic concept that helps explain this phenomenon is called doubling. Unlike splitting, which involves viewing people or situations as entirely good or entirely bad, doubling refers to the creation of a parallel moral self that operates according to a different ethical rule. Individuals and societies maintain their identity as caring, moral, and humane, while simultaneously participating in justifying or ignoring actions that violate those very same values. Doubling does not require cruelty or malicious intent. Rather, it allows otherwise decent people to adapt psychologically to situations that would otherwise be intolerable, preserving a positive self-image while remaining passive and complicit in the face of profound human suffering. Doubling helps explain several paradoxes in contemporary discourse of Gaza. Civilian killing is publicly disavowed, but little is done to stop it. Discussion of civilian suffering is permitted, but only if accompanied by, quote, a balanced viewpoint. As though there was a legitimate debate about the bombing, starvation, and killing of children. Psychiatrists highly trained to manage their countertransferences and process difficult emotions may nevertheless feel, quote, triggered and threatened by discussions of mass civilian harm and terms like genocide. Humanitarian awards are presented, but honest humanitarian discourse is not allowed or discouraged. Calls for objectivity and balance arrive exactly at the time when the pain of the child is about to be spoken. Even then, the pain of the vulnerable is not permitted to speak for itself. It has to be processed and reflected upon, lest the feelings of the powerful be hurt. These contradictions become possible when moral concern is compartmentalized, allowing individuals and institutions to uphold universal ethical principles in one context while suspending them in another. This is why testimony from our own physicians who have volunteered in Gaza is rebuffed or denied by medical organizations. Testimony that clearly established forensic evidence of deliberate killing of children by shooting in head and chest. This is Dr. Mark Perlmutter, a Jewish American orthopedic surgeon from North Carolina who volunteered in Gaza.
One father was explained to me that his kid was hurt down his hand. We were looking for him on the ground 10 meters away from his kid. When he came to us, he had no organs. We had no organs. Classic evidence, ability to suspend some sense of bone, ransom, and dislocations. Sense of bone, kids. He closed his phone, and I walked over, he had stopped. She was sheets.
Testimony from healthcare workers from Gaza is especially important because the international journalists have been banned from entering Gaza since the start of the conflict, and more journalists have been murdered in Gaza than the two world wars and Vietnam War combined. Restricting access to independent information from Gaza is one way to deny atrocities happening there, but denial is a much more complex process. A useful framework for understanding this process is Stanley Cohen's concept of states of denial. Cohen argued that denial is rarely a simple rejection of facts. Rather, it progresses through three stages. First, the literal denial, in which facts themselves are disputed, such as questioning the scale of destruction, famine, or civilian suffering in Gaza. Then, the interpretive denial, in which facts are acknowledged but reinterpreted to diminish their significance, such as describing the destruction as unavoidable, consequences of war, self-defense, or military necessity. And finally, the implicitory denial, in which both the facts and their meanings are accepted, but the moral and practical implications are denied, such as recognizing the killing and destruction, but refusing to call it a genocide or even a war crime. This is the most common form of denial in the medical community. Importantly, denial does not require proving that no atrocities occurred. It only requires creating sufficient doubt, ambiguity, or moral confusion to prevent meaningful moral, political, or institutional action. The abundance of evidence does not necessarily produce moral clarity. Rather, it can contribute to psychological paralysis and institutional inaction, as the human brain has a limited capacity to process facts, figures, and images. Repeated exposure to suffering may also lead to psychological numbing, in which the visibility of atrocities coexists with passivity and indifference. Now, coming back to my reference point of Holocaust, I want to examine these patterns of denial through the lens of Nuremberg trials. After World War II, an international military tribunal was established to prosecute leading Nazi criminals. There was considerable skepticism at that time about the trials, and even the New York Times published articles sympathetic to the Nazi defenders. At that time, modern international law was still in its infancy. The Genocide Convention had not yet been drafted, International Court of Justice did not exist, and Geneva Conventions would not be adopted until 1949. However, the Nuremberg prosecutors were determined. 3 of the 4 charges brought against the Nazi defendants were directly related to the conduct of war, but the prosecutors believed it was equally important to prosecute atrocities committed against Jews and other civilian populations. The closest charge to what we would call today genocide was the charge of crimes against humanity. This charge figured prominently in the prosecution of Hermann Goering, the highest-ranking Nazi leader to stand trial after Hitler's suicide. The central event in question was Kristallnacht, the Night of the Broken Glass, which took place on November 9 to 10, 1938. During this state-sponsored pogrom, close to 300 synagogues were destroyed, hundreds of Jews were killed, and thousands of them were arrested. Hermann Goering was widely believed to be one of the principal architects of Kristallnacht. However, prosecutors lacked documentary evidence directly linking him to the planning and execution of the attacks. Moreover, Goering himself challenged the tribunal's jurisdiction, arguing that the charges were being applied retroactively and the court had no jurisdiction over domestic German matters, when the charges of crimes against him did not even exist before the war. Nevertheless, the prosecutors found indirect evidence, such as a transcript of Goering's conversation with an insurance agent in which he directed that the Jewish victims be denied compensation for property destroyed. This was enough to convict him of crimes against humanity and sentence him to death by hanging. Compare this fragmented and incomplete evidence available after the Holocaust with Gaza. Gaza has unfolded under unprecedented real-time documentation. There exists extensive audio, video, photographic, satellite, forensic, and digital evidence of war crimes and destruction of civilian infrastructure. Even a few minutes search of the internet reveals hundreds of public statements by Israeli leaders openly calling to erase Gaza from the face of the earth. Examples include, quote, bring down buildings and bomb without distinction by members of the Knesset, describing Palestinians as, quote, animals who have no right to exist by the education minister. Erase Gaza, nothing will satisfy us by the deputy speaker of Knesset. Destroy Amalek by the prime minister. And, quote, there are no innocent civilians in Gaza by the president himself. Ironically, the Minister of Social Equality stated that she is personally proud of the ruins of Gaza. These statements are not confined to Israeli officials. Many U.S. lawmakers have also called for nuking Gaza, including Randy Fine, a congressman from Florida, who stated that he wants to see rivers of blood in Gaza. The cumulative evidentiary record is vastly more immediate, extensive, and publicly accessible than what prosecutors possessed at Nuremberg. It raises an uncomfortable question. If a Nuremberg-style tribunal was convened today, what defense would the perpetrators offer, and what verdict will the history ultimately render? The arguments offered to justify atrocities in Gaza are too numerous to analyze here individually, but I want to discuss one argument that I've encountered again and again. The chief argument is that the criticism of a foreign state credibly involved in atrocities and plausible genocide is somehow anti-Semitic. Notwithstanding the Jewish public opinion in the United States that overwhelmingly rejects this framing, and the recent polls suggest that a majority of American Jews oppose Israeli atrocities in Gaza, this argument is both immoral and dangerous to the collective Jewish identity. Anti-Semitism is a humane concept invoked to protect vulnerable Jewish communities, primarily in the West, where they live as minorities. It cannot be invoked to defend inhumane actions committed by a nuclear-armed state with one of the most powerful armies in the world. Doing so dilutes the meaning of anti-Semitism and renders it ineffective. It makes it much harder to confront real and rising anti-Jewish hate. Characterizing all Jews as supporters of state crimes creates the very essentialism, stereotyping, and collective responsibility that this concept of anti-Semitism is intended to combat. It is similar to separating Muslim identity from that of the terrorist after 9/11. This argument further breaks down when one considers the actions and statements of the state in question. Prime Minister of that state shocked the world in 2015 by claiming that Hitler did not originally want to kill the Jews, but it was a Palestinian mufti who persuaded him to do so. In almost every other context, such a statement would be regarded as Holocaust distortion or denial. More recently, Israeli public figures have openly invoked Nazi language while discussing Gaza. For example, Moshe Falen, a prominent politician and former member of the Knesset, stated, quote, "As Hitler said, I can't live if one Jew is left. We can't live here if one, quote, Islamo-Nazi remains in Gaza." Such statements raise difficult questions about the selective application of accusations of anti-Semitism. If criticism of state policies is automatically deemed anti-Semitic, how should one understand rhetoric that minimizes, distorts, or explicitly invokes aspects of Nazi ideology while discussing Palestinians and Gaza? However, this conflation of Jewish identity with state power reveals a deeper psychological process. Palestinian Muslims and Christians had nothing to do with the Holocaust or the historic persecution of Jews in Europe. They lived peacefully and harmoniously alongside an indigenous Jewish population for centuries. Palestinians provided refuge to persecuted Jews before and during the Holocaust, as all the Western countries, including the US, had blocked Jewish immigration during that time. And even though Palestinians lost their homeland and faced Nakba as a result of the events of the Nazi Holocaust, nonetheless, they are now framed as the symbolic inheritors of historic European anti-Semitism, Holocaust anxiety, and insecurity in the post-colonial context. As the statement by the Israeli Prime Minister suggests, the historic crimes of European anti-Semitism are psychologically projected onto a dependent, trapped, and traumatized Palestinian population. Psychologically, this process reflects what psychoanalytic theorists call identity fusion, the merging of state identity, collective trauma, and ethnic and religious identity into a psychologically inseparable whole. In this framework, criticism of state policy may be experienced not merely as political disagreement, but as an existential attack. The boundary between criticism of a government and the hostility towards Jews as a people becomes emotionally inseparable. Once this fusion occurs, opposition to state policy can be unconsciously interpreted as continuation of historical persecution. Human rights criticism becomes experienced not as ethical scrutiny, but as reenactment of anti-Semitic hostility. The calls for international justice are interpreted as blood libel. The result is a defensive psychological structure in which accusations of anti-Semitism function to neutralize moral challenges and protect collective innocence. This dynamic has several important consequences. First, it narrows the boundaries of permissible professional discourse because the individuals claim to be psychologically unsafe by mere mention of any challenge to their position, precluding any discussion of Palestinian humanity or a moral or legal analysis of their suffering. This misplaced and historically inaccurate interpretation of anti-Semitism also diverts attention from the deep roots of anti-Semitism within Western societies and from the contemporary rise of neo-Nazi, white supremacist, and far-right movements. I want to return back to the moral imperative of our profession. A year ago, while struggling to make sense of my own feelings of moral injury and disappointment in our institutions and government, I came across a remarkable book by Rabbi Sharfstein, a collection of Jewish sermons delivered during the Holocaust years. These sermons are filled with anguish over suffering of European Jewry and lament the silence and indifference of the wider world. Many speak directly to the failure of respected institutions, including the medical profession, to respond to the persecution and mass suffering. Reading them, I was struck by how the historical identities of victims and perpetrators may change, but the essential human experience of suffering remains the same. The moral question also remains the same. Whether we recognize the humanity of those who suffer, whether we find the courage to bear witness, and whether we choose silence or solidarity in the face of injustice. Ironically, this call of the agony in the pulpit was answered by an Arab American all these years later. Dr. Joel Abi Ratchet, a psychiatrist from Lebanon and historian of medicine at Harvard, spent years fighting with the New England Journal of Medicine over its silence during the Holocaust. She finally forced this prestigious journal to issue an apology over Nazism in 2005, only to find similar complicity and silence over Gaza, which she described as the Palestinian challenge to the US medical ethics. Today, this challenge is as acute as ever. Our professional societies seem to be violating medical ethics and their own policies on human rights, war crimes, and genocide by remaining silent on one of the gravest humanitarian catastrophes of our time, carried out with our taxpayer dollars and the complicity of our government. One wonders whether, had the major medical organizations fulfilled their moral obligations under medical ethics to call for a ceasefire and lifting of the siege on food, water, medicine, and humanitarian aid, how many children in Gaza might have been saved? As physicians and psychiatrists, we operate in a diagnostic framework. We identify a pathology, or at least give it a name before treating it. How absurd would it be to abandon well-established diagnostic terms in favor of, quote, just describe what is happening? These diagnostic terms summarize the vast amount of research and analysis that goes into naming the underlying processes. This is exactly what Dr. Chester M. Pierce did. He named the cruelty and racism of everyday life in the lived experience of African Americans, and therefore made it possible to express, analyze, and address it. Similarly, we must name the deliberately created public health and humanitarian calamity in Gaza with its proper legal and moral epithet. Only when this reality is acknowledged would it trigger the preventive measures implicit in such recognition, including demands to curtail the flow of weapons, financing, and political cover that enables the continued mass suffering. However, there's a lot our medical societies and organizations, including the APA, can do even without the explicit acceptance of the term. APA can use its advocacy to help secure access to life-saving medications and call for the lifting of siege on Gaza. APA can open its meetings, journals, and forums to document suffering of Palestinian populations in Gaza, just as it has done for other humanitarian crises. APA can call for the release of dozens of Palestinian doctors who are in Israeli jails without any charges for 2.5 years. They were arrested while they were treating their patients. Perhaps APA can facilitate more thoughtful conversations centered on humanity and justice for all people, regardless of their political influence or power, and can help construct a collective narrative of trauma that does not exclude Palestinians. I am more than hopeful that with the coalition of psychiatrists gathered on this call today from every religious, ethnic, racial, and cultural background, we can accomplish this together. We can help our profession live up to its highest ethical ideals and ensure that our organization does not repeat its worst mistake yet again by remaining silent in the face of mass human suffering. Finally, I want to reflect on this silence, their silence, our collective silence, the same silence that the Holocaust survivor and writer Elie Wiesel spoke about in 1977 when he said, "I'm obsessed with the silence because the silence of the world. I do not understand why the world was silent when we needed it. Its outcry. Where were the humanists, the leaders, the liberals, the spokesmen of mankind? The victims needed them. If they had spoken up, the killers would not have killed, or would have killed less. If they had spoken up, the slaughterer would not have succeeded in his task." I am emphatically positive that together we can answer Elie Wiesel's call and break this silence, not only for Palestinians, but for every vulnerable community whose suffering is too often overlooked, including the immigrants, the poor and indigent, people experiencing homelessness, the uninsured, racial and ethnic minorities, sexual minorities, Jewish communities facing anti-Semitism, Muslim communities facing Islamophobia, and all those who experience marginalization, discrimination, or exclusion. In doing so, we affirm the fundamental principle that every human life possesses equal dignity and deserves equal moral concern. Ultimately, our humanity is shared. To protect one, we must protect all. To save one, we must strive to save all. Thank you.
Yeah, okay, I'll talk. The moment I got off the elevator at the Moscone Center on Monday, May 8th, I knew something very unusual was happening. I encountered San Francisco police and bomb-sniffing dogs as I tried to find room 316, where Dr. Malik was supposed to speak. The room was filled with almost 200 young psychiatrists and residents, angry that the talk had been canceled that very morning. I said to myself, this is a sign of the times. In my 50 years of attending APA meetings, this was a first. Dr. Malik was extremely gracious in accepting the Chester Pierce Award from the APA leadership. It was then announced that the session was over and we were asked to leave. No one left. For over an hour, Dr. Ravi Chandra led an impromptu town hall meeting. We all had to speak up as the microphones were silenced, and we did speak up. What we missed then, and now hear virtually, is the thoughtful, scholarly, sometimes shocking talk appropriate for the space where psychiatrists must and can and weigh in and debate the ethics, the humanism, and international politics. Dr. Malik sets his perspective within global literature on genocide, finding commonalities between what is happening today and what has happened across the world. I especially appreciate Dr. Malik's review of the Holocaust literature, including Dr. Robert J. Lifton's Nazi Doctor book, a seminal work on the psychological mechanisms that allow educated humans to commit atrocities, including genocide. Psychiatrists need to read and reread this book, which I've just done. Just before his death, at age 100, Dr. Lifton warned of genocide in Gaza. As Dr. Malik explains, while there are commonalities in events that raise serious concerns for genocide, there are also differences. Israel was founded following the devastation of the Second World War, emerging from the ashes of the Holocaust with the slogan, "Never again," which means never again for all humanity, not just Jews. That Israel is committing these crimes, these horrific crimes, is more than ironic for me. It is personally, as a Jew, very painful to acknowledge and confront. Paradoxically, a profound history of collective trauma has had the effect for many of turning the G word, the genocide word, into a conversation stopper. It has had the effect of keeping many from giving serious consideration to the evidence of major human rights abuses and crimes perpetuated by Israel. Psychiatrists of all people need to be able to hear Dr. Malik's views, think deeply, respond, and pursue the truth. We as a profession need to stand tall when we perceive the violation of our ethics and assert our common humanity. We need to speak up. Dr. Chester Pierce would be proud today for Dr. Malik for receiving the award in his name, and so should APA. Thank you.
Thank you.